Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where we unlock the doors to the most spine-chilling, mysterious, and thrilling ghost stories. If you're brave enough to confront the dark secrets hidden in the shadows, join us on this journey into the unknown. Remember, sometimes the truth is scarier than anything you can imagine. Are you ready? Story 1. The Haunted Playground. The legend of the haunted playground in a remote village had persisted for decades. It all stemmed from a tragic accident over 30 years ago. One day, while 7 children were playing in the playground, one of them mysteriously disappeared. Some claim to have heard screams and eerie laughter before the remaining 6 children died under strange circumstances. Since then, the playground was abandoned, covered in dust, and became the subject of chilling rumors. It was said that every night, the spirits of the dead children would appear, playing on the swings and slides without anyone pushing them. Laughter and screams echoed from the shadows, enough to freeze anyone brave enough to visit. 30 years later, a group of 5 friends decided to investigate the rumors. They were young internet personalities who often filmed daring videos for their channel. "We'll become legends if we can debunk this myth," Mark, the group leader, said excitedly. They prepared flashlights, cameras, and recording equipment. When they arrived at the playground, the atmosphere was unsettling. Despite it being midsummer, the air was cold and damp, as if soaked in an inexplicable sadness. The trees were eerily silent, as though they too were afraid of what was to come. As they stepped into the central area, the swings began to sway unnaturally. Mark, feeling thrilled, shouted, "Record this! Record this! This will definitely go viral." While the others turned on their cameras, a shadowy figure suddenly appeared in the night. It was a small girl, her hair covering her face, wearing a white dress stained with dirt. She was sitting on one of the swings, staring directly at them. "Where did she come from?" Lily, the only girl in the group, stammered. "Maybe she's just a local kid," Mark reassured himself, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "Let's get closer and check it out." They approached, their flashlight beams illuminating the girl. But as soon as the light hit her, she froze and slowly lifted her head to face them. Her face was a blank slate. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, pale surface of skin. The faint laughter in the night turned into piercing screams. The swing spun wildly as if being pushed by invisible hands. The slide creaked ominously. A childlike voice rang out, "Play with me." Mark lost all composure. He screamed, "Run! Run!" They bolted, leaving the camera behind. When they looked back, they saw small, shadowy figures crawling after them, their forms dissolving into the darkness with every step. The gate to the playground slammed shut as they escaped. That night, while the group huddled in their rented house, they noticed something chilling. The camera left behind at the playground had turned off, but the footage it had recorded on their devices was even more horrifying. It showed the faces of each group member, their eyes and mouths erased, eerily resembling the blank face of the little girl. "Who recorded this?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Mark stared at the screen. "I don't know," he whispered, "but something has followed us." A loud knock echoed through the house. When they opened the door, no one was there. But on the ground outside, small footprints trailed away into the darkness. That night, they heard laughter echoing throughout the house. This time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within. Story 2. The Night of the Black Shu. August 4th, 1577, was a day forever etched in the memories of the villagers of Bungay, Suffolk. A storm, so fierce it seemed as if the heavens were waging war against the earth, tore through the countryside. The skies turned an unnatural black, lightning cracked like divine wrath, and the thunder boomed like the roar of ancient gods. Terrified villagers sought refuge in St. Mary's Church, clutching rosaries and murmuring prayers, hoping the sacred space would shield them from nature's fury. Inside the church, the air was thick with fear. The pastor stood at the pulpit, his voice rising above the deafening storm as he delivered his second sermon of the day. The congregation huddled together, the flickering candlelight casting wavering shadows on the stone walls. But as the pastor spoke the final words of his sermon, a deafening clap of thunder shook the church to its core. The great wooden doors burst open, slamming against the walls as a ferocious wind howled through the sacred space. And then it appeared. A massive black dog, larger than any wolf, with fur as dark as midnight and eyes that burned like fiery coals, emerged from the storm. Its breath, hot and foul, filled the church with the stench of brimstone. Every step it took echoed like the toll of a death knell. The congregation froze, their prayers dying on their lips as they stared at the beast in paralyzed terror. The Black Shu, a creature whispered of in hushed tones, a harbinger of death and doom, had come to claim its prey. The beast moved with unnatural speed, bounding up the aisle, its claws scratching deep grooves into the stone floor. A man in the center of the congregation, frozen in his pew, was the first to fall victim. With a guttural growl, the Shu leapt upon him, its fangs sinking deep into his back. Blood sprayed across the pews as the man's screams filled the air, only to be drowned out by the relentless storm outside. Others began to feel an inexplicable pain, as if unseen hands were clawing at their very souls. Some collapsed where they stood, clutching their chests, their faces twisted in agony. The air grew heavy, oppressive, as if the church itself was suffocating under the weight of the creature's malevolence. The Shu's rampage was swift and merciless. It tore through the congregation, leaving a trail of blood and destruction in its wake. Candles were knocked over, their flames extinguished, plunging the church into near darkness save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the chaos. The once sacred space now felt like the gateway to hell. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, the beast turned and bolted toward the open doors. Its departure was marked by an ear-splitting crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the church. And then, silence. The survivors, trembling and bloodied, tried to make sense of what had just occurred. But their ordeal was far from over. Mere moments later, reports began to pour in from nearby villagers of the Shu's presence at Holy Trinity Church, just a few miles away. There, the beast's fury was unleashed once more, its claws leaving scorch marks on the ancient wooden doors, marks that, to this day, bear silent witness to the horrors of that night. The days following the attack were filled with fear and speculation. Some claimed the Shu was a manifestation of the devil himself, sent to punish the unfaithful. Others believed it was an omen, foretelling a great calamity yet to come. The villagers, desperate for answers, turned to folklore and superstition. Crosses were hung above every door, and protective symbols were carved into door frames. But no amount of holy water or prayers could erase the trauma etched into their hearts. Among the survivors was a young woman named Eleanor, who had witnessed the Shu's attack from the safety of the church's balcony. She became obsessed with uncovering the truth about the beast. Driven by a mix of fear and fascination, she scoured old texts and spoke to elders who claimed to have encountered the Shu in their youth. The stories were chillingly consistent. The Shu appeared during storms, always at places of worship, and always left death in its wake. Eleanor's research led her to an old, weathered journal kept by a long-deceased priest. In its pages, she found a prophecy, a warning of a beast born from the sins of humanity, cursed to roam the earth as a reminder of mankind's hubris. According to the journal, the only way to banish the Shu was to confront it with unwavering faith and purity of heart. Months passed, and the villagers slowly returned to their routines, though the fear never truly left them. Then, one fateful night, as another storm descended upon Bungay, the Shu returned. This time, it was Eleanor who faced the beast. Armed with nothing but a cross and the strength of her convictions, she stood in the middle of St. Mary's Church, awaiting the creature's arrival. Lightning illuminated the darkened sanctuary as the Shuk's massive form emerged from the shadows. Its glowing eyes locked onto Eleanor, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The beast charged, its growls reverberating through the church. But Eleanor did not flinch. She held the cross high and began to pray, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. The Shuk halted mere inches from her, its breath hot against her face. For what felt like an eternity, the two stood locked in a silent standoff. And then, with a final deafening roar, the Shuk vanished, its form dissolving into the storm. The church fell silent, the oppressive weight lifted. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She had confronted the darkness and survived. Though the Shuk was never seen in Bungay again, its legend lives on. The scars it left, both physical and emotional, remain a haunting reminder of that fateful night. And on stormy evenings, when the wind howls and the thunder rumbles, some say you can still hear the faint growl of the Black Shu lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for its next moment to strike. Story 3. The Licked Hand. It was a quiet evening in the small suburban home where Emma lived with her loyal golden retriever, Max. The house, nestled in a peaceful neighborhood, seemed like the safest place in the world. But that night, an ominous cloud hung over the town. On the television, a news anchor delivered the chilling report. Breaking news. A dangerous serial killer has escaped from a nearby maximum security prison. Authorities urge all residents to lock their doors and windows and remain indoors. Emma's parents were away on a weekend trip, leaving her alone in the house. Though she was initially unfazed, the news report set her nerves on edge. Determined to stay safe, Emma made her way around the house, ensuring every door and window was locked. But when she reached the basement door, her heart sank. The lock was broken. She jiggled the handle a few times but couldn't secure it. "It'll be fine," she whispered to herself. "No one's going to come through the basement." She returned to her bedroom, bolting the door behind her. Max followed her faithfully and crawled under her bed, as he always did. His presence comforted her. No matter what, Max was there to protect her. As Emma climbed into bed, the familiar sound of Max's soft breathing lulled her into a false sense of security. She drifted off to sleep. In the middle of the night, Emma awoke to the faint sound of dripping water. It was coming from the bathroom adjacent to her bedroom. She squinted at the clock on her nightstand. 3:12 a.m. Too tired to investigate, she stretched her hand down to the floor. Max's warm, wet tongue licked her fingers reassuringly. "Good boy, Max," she murmured, and rolled over, letting sleep claim her again. But the dripping sound persisted, louder this time. It tapped against her nerves, demanding her attention. Half asleep, Emma reached her hand down again. Max licked her fingers once more, his presence a soothing balm against her unease. "I'll check in the morning," she thought, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The third time she woke, the dripping had grown louder, more insistent, as if something in the bathroom wanted her to hear it. Frustrated, Emma sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes. She glanced at the door to the bathroom. The soft light from the nightlight inside cast long, eerie shadows across the floor. Reluctantly, she swung her legs out of bed and stood. "Stay here, Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. The house was silent except for the steady drip, drip, drip. Emma shuffled toward the bathroom, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. As she pushed the door open, a metallic scent filled her nostrils. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Reaching for the light switch, she flicked it on. The sight before her was worse than anything she could have imagined. Max, her loyal protector, lay lifeless in the bathtub. Blood dripped steadily from his throat, pooling on the porcelain and staining the water a deep crimson. The dripping sound she had heard all night was the sound of his lifeblood falling into the water. Emma's knees buckled. She grabbed the doorframe to steady herself, her mind racing. Who could have done this? How had they gotten into the house? As her eyes darted around the bathroom, something on the mirror caught her attention. Written in Max's blood were the words, "Humans can lick too." A cold dread washed over Emma as the meaning sank in. The licks she had felt during the night, the reassurance she thought had come from Max, hadn't been from him at all. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned her gaze toward the bed. The room was dark, but she could make out a shadowy figure crouched beneath it. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused to obey. The figure shifted slightly, and the sound of labored breathing filled the room. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, Emma bolted out of the bathroom and down the hallway. She didn't dare look back. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of horrors. She sprinted down the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears. When she reached the front door, she fumbled with the locks, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Behind her, she heard slow, deliberate footsteps descending the stairs. She managed to fling the door open and ran into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. Emma didn't stop running until she reached her neighbor's house. She banged on the door until it opened, collapsing into the arms of a startled older man. Between sobs, she tried to explain what had happened. The police arrived within minutes. They searched Emma's house but found no sign of the intruder. The only evidence left behind was Max's lifeless body and the chilling message scrawled on the bathroom mirror. For weeks, Emma stayed with her neighbors, too terrified to return home. When she finally mustered the courage to step back inside, the house felt different. Empty, hollow, like the warmth it once held had been stripped away. She never found out who or what had been under her bed that night. The police speculated it was the escaped killer, but Emma knew deep down it was something far worse. The memory of that cold, wet lick on her fingers haunted her every night, a reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, it's closer than you think. Story 4. The Unmarked Grave. Jake was a seasoned hiker, always chasing the solitude of remote trails. For him, the wilderness was a place of freedom, untouched by human hands. But one autumn afternoon, as he wandered deeper into an isolated forest, he stumbled upon something he couldn't ignore. A lone grave, unmarked, half hidden under a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The grave stood out against the natural serenity of the woods. There was no headstone, no marker to hint at who lay beneath. Just a mound of earth that seemed slightly raised compared to the ground around it. Jake felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if it was silently demanding his attention. Despite his initial hesitation, Jake knelt by the grave. He spotted a smooth stone nearby and, almost as if compelled by some unseen force, he placed the stone on the mound. The act felt instinctive, like he was acknowledging the presence of whoever rested there. But the moment the stone touched the earth, a cold gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper he couldn't quite decipher. Jake brushed it off as his imagination and continued his hike. But that night, as he camped under a canopy of stars, sleep didn't come easily. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were anything but restful. In the dream, Jake found himself back at the grave. The forest was darker, the air heavy with an unshakable tension. From the shadows emerged a woman. Her face was obscured by a veil of darkness, but her sobs were unmistakable. "Help me," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. "I'm lost. Forgotten." Jake tried to speak, to ask who she was, but his voice failed him. The woman's figure dissolved into the night, leaving him alone with an overwhelming sense of dread. He woke up gasping, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The memory of her plea clung to him like a shadow. The next day, Jake returned to the grave, unable to shake the dream. To his shock, the stone he had placed on the mound was gone. It lay several feet away, as if someone, or something, had deliberately moved it. Unease prickled at his skin, but he convinced himself it was the work of an animal or a trick of the wind. Still, he placed the stone back on the grave before leaving. But the dreams continued. Night after night, the woman returned, her face becoming clearer with each visit. Her cries grew louder, more insistent. Jake began to recognize features: high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a sadness that seemed to seep into her very being. Then one night, he realized something chilling. Her face resembled that of a distant relative he had only seen in old photographs. The revelation set Jake on a relentless search for answers. He dug through family records, combed through old photo albums, and questioned distant relatives. The pieces slowly came together. The woman's name was Eleanor, a relative from several generations ago who had mysteriously disappeared. Family lore hinted at a tragic love affair and an untimely death, but no one knew the full story. Jake's obsession with Eleanor's fate consumed him. He became convinced that the unmarked grave held the key to her untold story. Determined to uncover the truth, Jake returned to the forest, this time equipped with a shovel. Digging up a grave felt wrong, sacrilegious even, but he couldn't ignore the pull Eleanor's spirit had on him. As the shovel bit into the earth, the wind picked up, and the forest seemed to darken around him. Each stroke felt heavier, as if the ground was resisting his intrusion. After what felt like hours, the shovel struck something solid. With trembling hands, Jake uncovered a wooden box, weathered by time. Inside were letters, brittle with age, written in a hurried scrawl. They told a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and murder. Eleanor had been lured into the woods by someone she trusted, only to be silenced forever. Her final letters revealed her murderer's identity and her desperate plea for justice. As Jake read the last letter, the air grew unbearably cold. A shadow fell over him, and when he looked up, he saw her. Eleanor stood at the edge of the clearing, her face no longer veiled. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with both gratitude and an unspoken warning. Then she was gone, leaving behind only the rustling of the trees. But the nightmare was far from over. Jake turned the letters over to the authorities, and the truth about Eleanor's death finally came to light. Her murderer's descendants faced public shame, and her story was immortalized in local history. Yet, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had disturbed something he shouldn't have. The dreams returned, darker and more violent. In them, Eleanor's cries for help turned to screams of rage. He began waking up with scratches on his arms, his belongings inexplicably moved, and a suffocating presence in his home. One night, as he lay in bed, paralyzed by an unseen force, he heard a whisper in his ear. "You've freed me, but the forest never forgets." The next morning, Jake's body was found in his home. The cause of death was officially listed as a heart attack, but those who saw his face spoke of an expression frozen in terror. His hands were clutching a stone, smooth, unremarkable, and eerily familiar. In the years that followed, hikers who ventured too deep into the forest reported hearing whispers carried on the wind and seeing a shadowy figure watching them from the trees. And those who stumbled upon the unmarked grave often felt compelled to leave a token behind, only to find it moved the next day. The legend of Eleanor's grave grew, but one thing remained clear. The forest had its own way of remembering, and it never truly let go. Story 5. The Vanishing Field. It was the afternoon of September 23, 1880, a day that would become the darkest in the history of a small farming town in Tennessee. David Lang, a humble farmer, was walking across his field towards his wife, Sarah, and their 2 children. The sky was a golden hue. The air was crisp with the onset of autumn, and everything about the day seemed ordinary. David waved at his family, a broad smile on his face. But in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Sarah Lang screamed, dropping the basket she was carrying. The children clung to her skirts, wide-eyed and trembling. She ran to the spot where David had disappeared, but there was nothing. No hole in the ground, no sign of disturbance. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The neighbors arrived soon after, summoned by Sarah's frantic cries. A search party was formed. They combed every inch of the field, the nearby woods, and even drained the creek, but there was no trace of David Lang. The ground where he had vanished was examined meticulously, but it was as solid and unyielding as the rest of the field. Weeks turned into months, and hope gave way to despair. David Lang was declared dead, though his body was never found. 7 months after David's disappearance, Sarah still refused to leave the farm. She clung to the hope that her husband would somehow return. Then, one late afternoon, while playing outside, their daughter Emily came running into the house, her face pale as a ghost. "Mama, I heard Papa," she cried. Sarah's heart raced. "What are you talking about, Emily?" "I was by the field, where he disappeared. I heard him calling my name," Emily said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It was his voice, Mama. I know it was." Against her better judgment, Sarah followed Emily to the field. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. The spot where David had vanished was marked by a strange phenomenon, a perfect circle of dead grass. The rest of the field was lush and green, but the circle stood out like a scar, a blemish on the otherwise serene landscape. Sarah's breath caught in her throat when she heard it, faint and distant, yet unmistakable. "Sarah, Emily." The voice was weak, desperate, as if it came from somewhere far away. "David?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. There was no reply. Emily tugged at her mother's sleeve, fear etched on her young face. "He's trapped, Mama. We have to help him." Sarah stepped closer to the circle, but as soon as she tried to enter it, a wave of cold air pushed her back. It wasn't natural. It was as if an invisible barrier was keeping her out. She screamed for David, but the voice grew fainter and fainter until it was gone. The days that followed were filled with terror. Every night, Sarah and Emily heard whispers coming from the field. The whispers would start faintly, then grow louder, filling the house, with an otherworldly presence. The whispers weren't just David's voice anymore. There were others, voices Sarah didn't recognize. Men, women, and children, all crying out in anguish. One night, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She grabbed a lantern and stepped out of her bedroom, calling for Emily. But when she reached her daughter's room, Emily was sound asleep. The footsteps continued, leading her to the front door. When she opened it, she saw them. Shadowy figures standing in the field, their forms barely distinguishable in the moonlight. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. Sarah slammed the door and bolted it, her hands trembling. But the shadows didn't leave. They lingered at the edge of the field, night after night, their presence a constant reminder of the horror that had taken hold of her life. Desperate for answers, Sarah sought out the town's oldest resident, an elderly woman named Abigail who was known for her knowledge of local folklore. When Sarah described the circle of dead grass and the voices, Abigail's face turned ashen. "The vanishing field," she whispered. "I've heard of it, but I never thought it was real." Abigail explained that the field was said to be cursed, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. It was a place where time and space could twist, trapping those who ventured too close. She warned Sarah to leave the farm immediately. "The longer you stay, the stronger its hold will become." It doesn't just take people, it takes their souls. Sarah couldn't bring herself to leave. She couldn't abandon the place where David had disappeared. But the hauntings grew worse. One night, Emily woke up screaming. "He's here, Mama, he's in my room." Sarah rushed to her daughter's side, only to find the words, "Help me," scrawled on the wall in what looked like ash. Emily swore she hadn't written it, and Sarah believed her. The final straw came one evening when Sarah ventured to the field alone, clutching a Bible and a cross. She stood at the edge of the circle, praying for David's soul. As she prayed, the ground within the circle began to churn, as if something beneath it was trying to claw its way out. Sarah dropped the Bible and ran back to the house, tears streaming down her face. The next morning, she packed their belongings and left the farm for good. She couldn't fight the field anymore. She couldn't save David. Years later, the farm remained abandoned. Locals avoided the area, claiming to hear whispers when they got too close. Some said they saw shadowy figures moving in the field at night. The circle of dead grass never grew back, a permanent scar on the land. And on quiet nights, when the wind was still, some swore they could hear a voice calling out from the field, faint and distant. Sarah, Emily. Story 6. Satan's Hollow. The Abyss Beneath. In the heart of Ohio, hidden beneath layers of urban legends and forgotten trails, lies a labyrinthine network of tunnels known as Satan's Hollow. By day, the site seems unremarkable, a concrete storm drain nestled in the woods. But by night, it transforms into a place of unspeakable dread, steeped in darkness and drenched in whispers of the occult. Local lore claims that during the 1960s, satanic cultists used the hollow to conduct rituals, summon spirits, and commune with forces beyond comprehension. Over the years, rumors swirled of sacrifices, unholy chants, and a portal to hell itself hidden within its depths. The site's dark reputation reached its zenith one fateful night when, according to legend, the cult's final ritual went catastrophically wrong. They claimed to have summoned Satan himself, and none who entered that night were ever seen again. The hollow was abandoned, but its sinister legacy continued to spread like wildfire, drawing in thrill-seekers and adventurers. Most came back trembling with terror, but some never returned at all. It was an unusually warm October night when 4 friends, Ethan, Lisa, Mark, and Rachel, decided to explore Satan's Hollow. They had heard the tales, dismissed them as folklore, and armed with flashlights and a camera, they ventured into the woods. For them, it was a chance to prove their bravery and perhaps capture something eerie on film for their growing YouTube channel. The entrance was as ominous as the stories described. A dark, gaping maw of concrete that seemed to breathe cold air into the warm night. Graffiti scrawled on the walls warned them to turn back and hell awaits. But they laughed it off as part of the mythos. Lisa, the most skeptical of the group, led the charge. "It's just a storm drain," she scoffed. "Nothing but urban legends to scare kids." They stepped inside, their voices echoing in the tunnel as their flashlights illuminated the damp, graffiti-covered walls. The further they ventured, the more oppressive the air became. A faint metallic scent hung in the air, and the sound of dripping water grew louder, masking the whispers that seemed to emanate from the shadows. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, stopping in her tracks. Ethan rolled his eyes. "It's just water dripping. Don't freak yourself out." But Rachel wasn't convinced. She could have sworn she heard something, a low murmur, almost like a chant. It was too faint to make out, but it sent a shiver down her spine. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. The walls were adorned with crude symbols, pentagrams, runes, and phrases written in an unrecognizable language. In the center of the chamber was a makeshift altar, a flat slab of stone stained with dark, dried streaks. Candles, long extinguished, were scattered around, their wax melted into grotesque shapes. Mark, always the thrill-seeker, moved closer to inspect the altar. "This is so staged," he said, pulling out his camera to film. "Someone probably set this up to scare people." As he spoke, a sudden gust of wind blew through the chamber, snuffing out their flashlights. The group froze in pitch darkness, the only sound the pounding of their hearts. "Turn the lights back on," Lisa hissed, her voice trembling. Ethan fumbled with his flashlight, but when it flickered back to life, the room had changed. The symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer, as if alive, and a dark liquid began to seep from the cracks in the floor. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of chanting returned, louder and clearer this time. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. But when they turned back toward the tunnel, the entrance was gone. The way they had come was now an unbroken wall of concrete. "What the hell is going on?" Mark shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Before anyone could respond, a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the chamber. It was followed by a deafening roar that shook the walls, sending chunks of debris falling from the ceiling. The group huddled together, their flashlights casting frantic beams of light as they searched for the source of the sound. From the darkness emerged a figure. Cloaked in shadow, its form was indistinct, but its presence was overwhelming. Its eyes burned like embers, and its voice was a cacophony of whispers and screams. "You dare trespass on sacred ground?" the entity intoned. Lisa, paralyzed with fear, managed to stammer, We didn't mean to." The figure stepped closer, and the air grew impossibly heavy. "You seek the truth?" it asked. "Then bear witness." The chamber began to shift, the walls melting away to reveal a vast, endless void. The group found themselves standing on a narrow platform, surrounded by swirling darkness. The entity raised a hand, and the void filled with horrific visions. Faces contorted in agony, bodies consumed by fire, and rivers of blood flowing endlessly. Ethan screamed, dropping his flashlight as the visions overwhelmed him. Rachel clung to Lisa, tears streaming down her face. Mark, ever the skeptic, tried to reason with the entity. "This isn't real. You're just trying to scare us." The entity's laughter echoed through the void. "Your reality means nothing here. You have entered my domain, and you will not leave unchanged." The platform began to crumble, and one by one, the group fell into the abyss. They landed in a shallow pool of viscous crimson liquid. The walls around them pulsed like a living thing, and the chanting grew deafening. Lisa was the first to notice the figures emerging from the walls. Humanoid shapes with hollow eyes and mouths stretched in silent screams. They reached for the group, their touch ice-cold and suffocating. Rachel was dragged away, her screams fading into the darkness. Ethan tried to pull her back, but it was too late. When the sun rose the next morning, search parties found no trace of the four friends. The camera Mark had been carrying was discovered near the entrance to Satan's Hollow, its footage intact. The video ended abruptly, cutting off just as the group entered the chamber. Locals who viewed the footage spoke of hearing whispers and screams in the background, even when the video was silent. Some claimed to see shadowy figures in the corners of the frame. The tape was eventually destroyed, but the legend of Satan's Hollow only grew stronger. To this day, no one who ventures into the Hollow comes back unchanged. Some return with haunted expressions and refuse to speak of what they saw. Others are never seen again. And on quiet nights, when the wind is still, the sound of chanting can be heard emanating from the tunnels, a chilling reminder that some places are better left undisturbed. Story 7. The Bell from Beneath. In the late 19th century, fear of premature burial was a widespread terror. To ease these fears, coffins were often equipped with safety devices, a tube leading to the surface and a bell attached to a string, allowing anyone buried alive to ring for help. In most cases, the bells never rang. But in the small, mist-shrouded town of Millhaven, One such bell would sound, bringing with it a tale of horror that would haunt the town for generations. Harold Glover was Millhaven's gravedigger and caretaker of its sprawling cemetery. By day, Harold was a stoic figure, moving among the graves with an air of calm detachment. But by night, when the winds howled and shadows stretched long, Harold's duty became a grim vigil. He had heard the bells ring before, though it was always the wind or the cruel pranks of local children. That changed one cold autumn night. The night was eerily quiet, the usual howls of the wind replaced by an oppressive silence. Harold sat in his small caretaker's hut, sipping a mug of whiskey-laced tea when the sound came. A bell rang, clear and deliberate, cutting through the stillness. Harold froze, the mug slipping from his hands and shattering on the floor. It wasn't the sporadic clang of wind or the random jingle of a child's mischief. This was rhythmic, desperate, a cry for help. He grabbed his lantern and shovel, heart pounding as he stepped into the cold, misty graveyard. The bell's sound guided him, its metallic chime growing louder with each step. The fog parted like curtains, revealing the source, the grave of Sarah O'Bannon. She had been buried 6 months earlier after succumbing to a sudden illness. Her grave was unremarkable, save for the bell atop its surface, now swinging wildly. Harold approached, his lantern casting flickering light on the tombstone. It read, Sarah O'Bannon born, September 17th, 1853. Died February 19th, 1880. As the bell rang on, Harold crouched by the tube and called down, "Hello? Who's there?" A voice answered, muffled but unmistakably human. "Please, let me out, I'm alive." Harold's blood ran cold. "Are you Sarah O'Bannon?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yes," the voice cried. "It was a mistake. I'm not dead. Please dig me up." Harold hesitated. "Your tombstone says you died in February," he said. "This is October. How can you still be alive?" "I don't know," the voice sobbed. "But I'm here. Please, Harold, for the love of God, dig me up." His hands trembled as he touched the bell, silencing its frantic clanging. He stared at the grave, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill in the air. Something about the voice didn't sit right with him. It was too steady, too wrong. "If you're truly alive, why haven't you suffocated?" he asked, his tone sharper now. The voice faltered. "The tube. I've been breathing through the tube." Harold's grip on the shovel tightened. "But that's not how it works," he muttered to himself. Something was deeply unnatural about this. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, an instinctual dread that clawed at his sanity. "Please, Harold," the voice begged again. "Don't leave me here." But Harold made his decision. He stood, stepping on the bell's string to silence it completely. With trembling hands, he packed the tube's opening with dirt, blocking it off entirely. The voice screamed, a guttural wail that echoed through the cemetery, growing fainter as the tube filled. Then, silence. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Harold whispered, stepping back from the grave. "But whatever you are, you're not alive." The days that followed were uneasy. Harold couldn't shake the memory of Sarah's voice, the way it lingered in his mind like a bad dream. At night, he swore he heard faint whispers outside his hut. But when he looked, the graveyard was empty. A week later, the bell rang again. This time, it wasn't just Sarah's grave. Bells all across the cemetery began to chime, their discordant symphony filling the night air. Harold, clutching his lantern, ventured out once more. The fog was thicker than before, curling around his legs like living tendrils. As he approached the graves, the bells fell silent, one by one, until only Sarah's remained. Harold stood frozen, his lantern shaking in his grip. From the shadows of the cemetery, figures began to emerge. They were pale, gaunt, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if their bodies were being puppeteered by unseen strings. "You left us here," a voice said. It was Sarah's, but it no longer sounded human. "You buried us alive. Now we'll take you with us." Harold dropped his lantern and ran, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures pursued him, their hollow eyes fixed on him with predatory intent. He reached his hut and slammed the door shut, bolting it and barricading it with whatever he could find. But it didn't stop them. The last thing Harold saw was Sarah's face pressed against the window, her lips curling into a smile far too wide for any human. The door burst open, and the lantern's light went out. When the townsfolk came to the cemetery the next morning, Harold was gone. His hut was empty, the door splintered, and his tools lay scattered across the ground. But the most chilling discovery was the bells. Every grave had its string cut, the bells lying silent and still in the dewy grass. All except for one. Sarah O'Bannon's bell stood upright, its string intact, and as the wind passed through the graveyard, it rang once, softly, as if in warning. The townsfolk never spoke of Harold again. The cemetery became a place of fear, avoided by all except the dead. And on cold autumn nights, when the mist rolls in, the faint sound of a bell can still be heard, echoing through the hollowed ground, calling out to those foolish enough to listen. Story 8. The whisper in the night-night had fallen, and the pale moonlight filtered through the ancient trees in an abandoned forest that had long been shrouded in mystery. People called it the Shadow Forest because of the countless unexplained stories surrounding it. For centuries, many who ventured into the forest never returned, and those who did carried horrifying tales. Yet, the lure of the unknown still tempted some to test their courage. That evening, 4 young friends decided to camp in the forest, ignoring all the warnings. Anna, the bravest of the group, was the one who suggested the idea. She was always drawn to the supernatural and craved thrilling experiences. Joining her were Max, an adventure enthusiast, Linda, a curious soul fascinated by the paranormal, and Tom, Anna's calm and rational boyfriend. As the lights of the distant town faded behind them, the 4 ventured deep into the forest. Massive trees stood motionless, their canopies blotting out the sky. The atmosphere grew suffocating as the last light of day vanished entirely. They set up camp near a small, still pond, its surface as dark as ink, reflecting the moonlight eerily. The chirping of insects around them only heightened the oppressive air. As night enveloped them, they lit a campfire and gathered around to tell ghost stories. Linda spoke of a mysterious woman who was said to wander the forest at midnight, dressed in a pristine white gown, singing haunting lullabies that bewitched anyone who heard them. Anna laughed, unfazed. "These are just baseless rumors. We're here to prove there's nothing scary about this forest." But as the night deepened, things began to change. An unusual cold wind swept through, causing the campfire to flare and then extinguish, plunging them into darkness. Max pulled out a flashlight, but its feeble beam couldn't pierce the dense shadows. The chirping insects abruptly fell silent, replaced by an ominous stillness. Tom suddenly pointed toward the pond and whispered, "Look over there." On the still surface of the water, they saw a faint silhouette standing motionless. It was a woman with long, tangled hair and a mud-streaked white dress. Anna grabbed a stick and shouted, "Who's there? If you're trying to scare us, it's not working." But the figure remained silent, slowly turning to reveal a pale face with empty black sockets where eyes should have been. Linda screamed in terror, but Anna refused to believe her eyes. "It's got to be someone playing a trick," she said, though her voice trembled. Max grabbed Linda's hand, saying, "We need to leave right now." But as they turned to flee, the figure was suddenly right in front of them, mere steps away. A dry, raspy laugh echoed, inhuman and chilling. They ran, but the forest seemed to transform around them. The paths they had walked earlier now became a labyrinth of endless turns. Anna yelled, "This is impossible. We just came this way." The trees seemed alive, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms as they fled. Finally, they stumbled upon an old wooden cabin hidden deep in the forest. With no other options, they rushed inside. The wooden door slammed shut behind them. Inside, a dim light from an old oil lamp illuminated a dusty, decrepit room. The cracked wooden walls were covered with portraits of strangers, all of them with blank faces, no eyes, no mouths. Linda sobbed. "We shouldn't have come here. This is all our fault." Before anyone could respond, a whisper echoed from a dark corner of the cabin. "Welcome home." They turned to see a tall figure standing in the shadows, its face obscured by the darkness. "We have to get out of here," Tom shouted, pulling Anna toward the door, but the door now led to a long, dark hallway instead of the outside. The whisper followed them, growing louder. "No one leaves." Max suddenly fell, crying out in pain. When Linda bent down to help him, she saw a hand reaching up from beneath the floorboards, gripping his ankle tightly. More hands began to emerge, clawing at them. Anna swung her stick desperately, but the hands seemed made of mist, unaffected by her strikes. Eventually, they were dragged into another room, larger than the last. At its center stood an old wooden table with a large book bound in what looked like human skin. Tom, as if entranced, approached the book. "Don't!" Anna screamed, but it was too late. When Tom opened the book, a chilling cold swept through the room. The whispers turned into deafening screams, and darkness engulfed them all. The next morning, a group of rangers found the campsite abandoned by the pond. There was no trace of the four friends, except for a message carved into a nearby tree. "Never come back." From that day forward, anyone who dared to step into the shadow forest was never seen again. The locals claimed to hear whispers in the wind every night, as if the forest itself was retelling the tale of the lost souls trapped within.